Everybody, thanks for joining us today. We're going to get started in just a minute or two, but we're going to give it just a second more for folks to join. All right. Well, thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're really excited to kick off what is a new initiative for SEEA, and we'll talk a lot more about that. But before we do, would love to introduce myself. My name is Will Bryan. I'm the Director of Research at SEEA. I've been at SEEA about 8 years, and this is an initiative that we've really been doing since 2023, when we wanted an outlet to really look at data across the South that we thought was interesting, that related to our work, that would kind of give us interesting research ideas or connect to policy. And so since 2023, we've been putting out a map every month. This is our map of the month series on SEEA's blog, where we dive into a whole host of topics. If you go to our website, which we'll pop in the chat, you can take a look at some of these old maps of the month. But they really run the gamut, everything from energy use to gentrification to broadband access to workforce topics like we're going to talk about today. And as we've kind of thought about how that has evolved, we really want to make sure that these are connected to sort of last mile policy solutions, and that our work can very much be used to inform policy and programming throughout the region. And we see this as a key way to kind of tell stories that can help with that, to outline and look at data that can help with that. And so, what we're doing is we're starting a new webinar series every month where we're going to kind of talk through the map that we are publishing. We'll talk through the data. We'll go behind the scenes. We'll kind of connect to how we did how we made our maps, how we ran the analysis, what we think is really critical about it, how it maybe connects to work that SEEA is doing throughout the 12 states of the Southeast that we serve. And then, hear from you about what topics are helpful in the future, what formats are helpful in the future, and really have a discussion about, how can we use this data set or this map to inform, something bigger, some sort of policy change or programmatic change that is going to help people on the ground. So that's what we're doing today. We're going to kick that off today, and we're going to walk through the map that we just published for May. We're going to talk about what we found, how we did it, and what we think it means. And then we want to hear from you. We want to know a little bit about maybe how you could envision using this information. What other types of data or information do you need in the work that you're doing throughout our region? What questions do you have for us about, this map or maps that we've done in the past? And as you probably know, the map that we're talking about today is focused on mapping workforce deserts throughout the South. And this is something that we've heard over and over again as we travel throughout the South, is that this is a major concern. And just to give you kind of one example of that, I was recently in Eastern North Carolina in a rural county, and we were meeting with some community-based organization partners who do workforce training and education. And it became clear that just the lack of workforce in that county is a major, major problem. In North Carolina, there's a state home energy rebate program, and that county alone had like 800 to 1,000 households that had signed up that were, generally all low and moderate income, that would really benefit from this program. And what our partners told us is that there was essentially one contractor for that county who could do the work. And so it's a major bottleneck. And we wanted to kind of understand how representative that story was across the South. Where are those pockets where workforce is a really key bottleneck to scaling, home weatherization and retrofit efforts that we think are super critical to lowering bills, to improving the quality of housing, to improving health outcomes for occupants. And so that's really the genesis of the map that we're going to be talking about today. And so I want to share my screen so we can kind of get a first look at it. Um, and whoops, there we go. Thank you. And I'll kind of talk you through this. We know that there are a ton of barriers to scaling or even maintaining energy efficiency and weatherization programs throughout our region. I think our research is underlying one component of that, but one super crucial component that really can be make or break for these programs, and that is, do you have people who can do the work and who know how to do the work, who are trained, and who are available to do the work? And one of the things that we found is that many communities throughout the South simply do not. And so, weatherization and energy efficiency programs in these communities are always going to run up against workforce barriers that make it hard to complete home upgrades that would bring meaningful benefits to communities at scale, simply because there are not enough workers. And to do this, so here you can see this is a map of the 12 states that SEEA serves. We mapped this out at a county level where we assessed kind of the risk of a county being a contractor desert, essentially, where there just simply aren't enough workers to do home upgrade or to meet kind of local home upgrade needs. And to do this, we pulled data from the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, which is a U.S. Department of Energy sponsored product, showing the number of energy efficiency workers in each county. And we combined that with a handful of other census data sets to estimate really kind of two things. The first is to estimate how many energy efficiency workers there were per 1,000 housing units across every county in these 12 states. And one thing to note, what we're measuring here is not all construction workers, not all contractors. We're measuring people who are kind of relevant to improving the efficiency of housing, or who are trained to improve the efficiency of housing. And so we use some kind of specific ways of slicing and dicing the data to understand which contractors, which HVAC workers are actually performing efficiency work, or are kind of primed to perform efficiency work. And so this is a pretty granular snapshot of the workforce who would be needed to do home upgrades that are going to improve efficiency of housing at scale. So for instance, if you're a technician and you just replace a gas furnace with a gas furnace that's the same efficiency, you are not included in this data set. But if you're installing heat pumps, or if you're installing high efficiency appliances or other equipment, then you would be included in the definition that we used here. Because we really wanted to assess the workforce that is relevant to, efficiency upgrades, heat pump installs, weatherization, building envelope work, that kind of thing. So what did we find? And before I move to that, I should note we also assess the need for housing upgrades across each of these counties, because we wanted to see, where does a lack of contractor capacity line up with maybe a lot of housing need, and there's a mismatch there. And so what we did is we looked at the proportion of households built before 1980. 1980 is kind of when the first energy codes were introduced nationally. So this is the first minimum standard for efficiency, first time when houses were really, started to be built to some minimum standard of efficiency. And we also looked at household income, which we think is an indicator of, the likelihood that someone can upgrade their home over time. If you have a low income, you're not going to have the cash or the capital to make, major upgrades over time. And so we think it's a good kind of indicator of where there might be home upgrade needs, deferred maintenance, things like that. Okay, so now what did we find? You can kind of see it here in the map, but for one, we found that there are 190 counties across the South that we define as being in crisis. That means there's extremely high need for home upgrades in that community, and there's extremely low workforce capacity in that community. And you can see, these are the counties indicated in the dark red throughout the map here. But, even beyond these counties that are kind of in crisis because they have, really severe housing needs and really low workforce capacity, we found that, about half of counties throughout the South either already are workforce deserts for the kind of work that we're talking about, or are, very much kind of on the cusp of becoming a workforce desert. And just to give you kind of a couple of examples, in crisis counties, what we found is that there's basically one efficiency worker for every 411 homes. So one worker serving, about 400 homes. Across the region, it's about 1 to 90. So you can see that, there's a real gap there in some of these crisis counties in terms of workforce capacity, ability to perform work at scale that really inhibits expansion of efforts. When you look at the map, I think two places probably stand out to you the most as being perhaps the most at risk or in crisis. One is Appalachia. You can see it here, particularly Eastern Kentucky and basically all of West Virginia. Kentucky leads the region with 33 counties in crisis. West Virginia has 32. And together that's about a third of all the counties across the South that we consider to be in crisis. And that is, just as a reminder, that's where there is high housing upgrade demand or need and kind of workforce deserts. These areas, maybe not surprisingly, they have, older than average housing stock. They have very low incomes. They have not a lot of work for existing contractors, and they're often kind of remote from, city centers where there may be more sustained, workforce opportunities. And so, the result is that all of these factors combine to make these areas particularly at risk for both housing quality issues, and, there are steep barriers to addressing this because there's just not a workforce that can address it. The other area is really the kind of Black Belt region of the South, particularly kind of South Alabama and then this Mississippi Delta up into Arkansas and, kind of Eastern Louisiana region. And just to kind of put a few numbers on this, Evangeline Parish in Louisiana has as few as 20 upgrade workers serving about 14,500 homes. That's one worker for every 726 houses. And Dallas County, right there, with the county seat being Selma, has, a similar proportion, about 80 workers for 19,000 housing units. And, this is an area that SEEA has done some work in. And, I just want to point out this is particularly stark given that about 40% of all housing in the city of Selma was destroyed in a tornado in 2023. And there are kind of active rebuilding and rehab programs that are ongoing. And so the fact that, there's such a workforce shortage there shows some of the bottlenecks that are being faced in disaster recovery and rebuilding in a community like Selma. And, kind of underlines, I think, the stakes that are involved in these questions. Just to point out, I think these are conservative numbers based on the way that we have defined our method. We did a cross-check using some data from a different census data set, and it told a really consistent story. And it showed, that while rural areas or underserved communities may actually have a lot of construction workers who live in those communities, they don't work in those communities. They commute to higher income, they commute to higher volume areas, generally that are going to be closer to cities or urban markets rather than serving the communities that they live in. So we think there's a lot of opportunity here, but, based on kind of the market and the ways that, upgrade needs flow through the market, we're seeing that there's this kind of really outmigration of workers to areas that, just have a more substantial market to fuel that work. So here, really quickly, I want to kind of talk about a couple of key takeaways that we see, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague for a second. But one is pretty clear. There are kind of two priority geographies here in the South. I mean, there are many places that face crisis, but when we look at kind of whole regions that face crises, it's Appalachia and the Black Belt region. These are communities where incomes are low, housing is old, and there just aren't enough workers to serve the need. And there are also places that really are not going to be reached by market solutions because, people don't have income or capital to invest in home upgrades. So, they really need to be engaged on their own terms with programs that are designed to support, both capital and, support the workforce that is needed to retrofit homes. The second thing is that we see a lot of opportunities for retraining. There are many counties that look well served when you look across all construction workers. But when you look at people who are actually performing efficiency upgrades, they are not well served. And so that means there's kind of a lot of sort of conventional construction workers in about 99 counties across the South that otherwise are considered to be deserts. And that's a real opportunity for, retraining, for engagement and programs, for kind of targeting to energy specific upgrades that are going to both improve business outcomes for those workers, but also improve quality of life for people living in those communities. And then the last point that I just want to underline is that the kind of window for all of this is narrowing. A lot of the federal incentives that have provided momentum for upgrades are either proposed for elimination or have already been eliminated. A good example is the 25C Energy Efficiency Home Improvement Tax Credit. The Weatherization Assistance Program is potentially on the chopping block in the latest budget draft from the federal government that we've seen. And the workforce is aging, and this is particularly going to hit places that are underserved, much more dramatically. And so, the time really to invest in building pipelines for workers is now, because otherwise these places are going to continue to be underserved, and those problems are only going to get worse as we go. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amy, to talk through sort of a broader look at the energy efficiency workforce across the region based on our map from last month, and then we'll open it up for some questions and discussion.
Okay, thank you, Will. I think that I'm also going to share my screen. I'm going to drop a couple of links into the chat. One is to the SEEA and the Clean Jobs reports that have summaries of this for the entire nation if you're interested in things beyond the Southeast. In the meantime, I will share my screen to the previous month's map. I have lost the share screen button. Where's the oh, there, I got it. I had to hit the more button. It's always the more button. My apologies. Okay, so okay, is it sharing the screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So we looked at the workforce. Every year, the Department of Energy puts out the Energy Workforce Report. And we look particularly at the clean energy and the energy efficiency portions of that. So the first map that I'm showing here is, I could probably make it a little bigger. Nope, I'm not going to do that. The clean energy jobs, basically, this is, oh, here, I will also drop this in the chat. Actually, that's going to be hard. Can one of you drop that in the chat?
Sure.
You can just.
I've got it.
Oh, thank you, Laura. I was like, that's not going to be easy. But that way you can have it on your own screen and you can mouse around. But basically it shows what fraction of the energy workforce in each state is working in clean energy. When we say clean energy, so we mean renewable power generation, renewable fuels, like biofuels, those kinds of things. Alternative fuel vehicles, so hybrids, electrics, those sorts of things. Energy storage related jobs, grid innovations, grid upgrades, grid efficiency, those sorts of things, and also energy efficiency. So like Will was talking about the people working in HVAC, for example, the energy efficiency portion of that would be somebody who was upgrading or installing new or more efficient equipment in the home, not necessarily people who are just repairing or replacing existing equipment with more of the same. So Energy Star ratings and those kinds of appliances would be under this category. So region-wide, it's about 42% of the workforce. And so you can see we have a few states that have higher fractions. Florida has 53% of the energy workers in that state. North Carolina has 53% of energy workers, and Virginia 55%. Our lows are in Louisiana 22% and West Virginia 14%. So those are areas where more people are involved in the clean energy workforce. Another way to look at it is what fraction of the energy workforce is working in efficiency in particular, not all clean energy, but in efficiency related jobs. This is primarily home upgrades, building upgrades, right? Is what this is primarily. And a lot of it is heating, ventilation, and air conditioning. But this is normalized to 100,000 workers, because if you just plot how many workers there are working in efficiency, since Florida is a larger population, you get a larger indication that Florida is participating. But if you normalize to 100,000 workers, you can see, and again there, that Virginia stands out, and North Carolina stands out with 37% of the energy workers in efficiency, and in Virginia, 40% in working in efficiency. So you can find your state of interest on here, and you can, these are in that April map. So basically, what we were trying to show here was how people are engaged in the workforce, and then how people are serving. This is where it led to the serving question. But I also wanted to point out that energy jobs are good jobs, and these are well-paying jobs. And it was important to highlight that this is a path forward for people in underserved areas to get into the workforce in these areas, to have good wages in good jobs. So there was one other place that I wanted to show, was the rural characteristic, and I'm just going to show that on the map itself. Right, so if you look at, there's a map here, hopefully you can see that well enough. These are the counties that are considered rural or small town. And what we've done is we've highlighted the clean energy jobs in those. So from 0 to 1,500 is the color scale here. And the county only shows up if it is more than 50% rural, or more than half the census tracts in that are outside the metro area. And so we just made a little histogram of the percentage of jobs versus the percentage of the population that are in primarily rural areas. And you can see that it's close to parity in a lot of places, the fraction of the population that lives in these rural areas versus the fraction of jobs that are in these areas. But there are some outliers. Kentucky, for example, has a much larger rural population than it does clean energy jobs in those rural locations. And of the states that SEEA works with, only Hawaii, which is an unusual state in a lot of ways, only Hawaii has a slightly higher proportion of rural energy jobs than it has population. So those are some things about population and energy in general that led us to thinking about, where are the workers and where do we need the workers to be as a workforce development conversation. All right, back to you, Will.
Excellent. Well, thanks, Amy. Yeah. And so now we'd love to turn it over to y'all to ask any questions that you have about the maps. We're happy to answer any questions about how we did this, what we found. We're happy to do a deep dive. Whatever is helpful, I'd say feel free to pop a question in the chat if you have them, and we're happy to address it. We'd also love to hear more about how you could use these and how you might envision using these maps. Our goal is that our research doesn't sit on the shelf, that it informs change that needs to be made across the South. And there's a lot of change that needs to be made across the South. And we want our research really to help inform that and to guide that, because it needs to be, data driven. And so we'd love to hear more about, kind of how could you envision this type of work being useful to you in, whatever it is that you're working on. Are there formats that would be helpful, for you in, kind of seeing this information and using it in your day to day, kind of all of this. And I think finally we'd also like to know, how does this track with your understanding of what's on the ground? I think, when we as a team look through these maps, we're like, oh yeah, these all of these things make sense to us. We want to ground truth the data and make sure that it doesn't seem, out of the norm. And I think when we see, trends like the ones that we see in kind of both of these maps, it really kind of rings true. But, we also want to know more about, is that the case with you? And I think I'll share my screen again, just so we have the map up as we talk through this. And I think one thing I can note is that um, in a lot of ways, I mean, the geography that we see here is the geography that we see for most issues across the South. If you take many different issues, income, poverty, housing age, uh, access to health insurance, kind of whatever it may be. We see pretty similar geographies here, though with a little bit more, I think we often see a little more, kind of vulnerability maybe in sort of Eastern North Carolina and the band that really runs throughout, kind of this Black Belt region and into Louisiana and Mississippi. So I think, when we look at the map, it rings true when we check the county that we visited in North Carolina, where, we heard that there was basically one qualified contractor trying to serve about 1,000 households. It tracks with what we see in this map. Yeah, but what questions
We have a
do we have?
question.
Yes.
The question has come in. I'm curious what particular roles we are seeing gaps in the energy efficiency field. What are the main barriers to entry and scaling, and how does that differ in different parts of the South?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think the main gap, I mean, I think there's kind of two main gaps that we see. But the really kind of acute one, I think, is sort of HVAC uh, workers, the HVAC workforce. HVAC drives a lot of the energy use in people's homes. And, I think a lot of the gaps, particularly in areas that show up as crisis counties here, are HVAC technicians. Because HVAC repairs are incredibly costly. If you buy a new HVAC system, you have to have some capital to do that. And, a lot of the communities where we see these crisis counties, just aren't going to have the capital to do that without some sort of assistance. And so, I think in a lot of these counties, the real kind of barrier, at least on the home upgrade side, is HVAC, because that is something that, that also tracks with these other kind of data points that we're covering. Can you remind me what the other
Piece
pieces
of
of
the
that
question
question were?
The main barriers to entry and scaling, how it differs in different parts.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the main barriers in these communities is money, honestly. I think HVAC technicians are going to go where the money is, because that's how you have to run a business. But, if we look at Eastern North Carolina or West Virginia, there's just no capital, kind of as a whole, to invest in a new HVAC system, particularly in a high efficiency HVAC system. And there may not be, a lot of knowledge about a heat pump or some sort of high efficiency equipment in those communities, just because nobody's able to invest in them. And I think, I don't want to single those two places out, because I think this is true in a lot of places. I mean, this is true in like parts of Atlanta. This is true in parts of Orlando. This is true almost everywhere, that there are going to be pockets where people don't have capital to invest in these issues. But in a metro area, the problem is a little bit more contained because you have a workforce, that is serving other parts of that metro that may be nearby. Whereas in some of these more rural communities, I think the problem is distance and, kind of volume of business. So I think that's a huge problem. I think, we're not going to solve this problem without, really impactful programs that help with sort of the capital piece for households that can address it. I don't see this as a problem that's going to be solved by the market, because, it is being made worse by the market. And so I think, when we think about a weatherization program, it really needs to combine some, effort to get capital to households that need it with, really close attention to the workforce that's going to do that work in a particular community if you're going to scale it. And I think a good example of this is the home energy rebate programs that are statewide, which kind of offer the same experience across the state, but may underserve certain communities just because the workforce doesn't exist there and it's harder to get to those communities. So I think, those are kind of a particularly good example of how, the same approach to Raleigh that you take in like Halifax County, North Carolina, or the same approach in, Albany, Georgia, that you're going to take in Metro Atlanta, is going to create different outcomes just because there's different workforces, in those respective communities. Great.
Great. So there's more.
Yeah, great.
Some suggestions of extensions to the work to collect and track data on the workforce development efforts and compare those workforce development effort location to these locations. And Jenny mentioned thinking of the money that Google is and will be investing in the Arkansas side of the Mississippi Delta. And then the contrapositive of that, or the contra negative, whatever it is, the flip side of those investments probably won't yield fruit for a long time, but it might be nice to know where there's nothing happening to prioritize action in those places. So if we could map out where there isn't a workforce program, that could be helpful. That was a great suggestion. Thank you, Jenny.
Yeah, great suggestion. And, I want to note, I mean, this is a starting point for us. And we really, do intend to dig into questions like that, to really kind of fine tune our understanding of the region and, be able to help guide efforts. So that is particularly helpful. Yeah, thank you.
All right, that's what we have right now.
Okay.
Anything surprise you in this data? Any other terrific suggestions for extensions, things you might like for your own work to support you?
And while those are coming in, I mean, I think one thing that we really want to do is get this to be more granular. I think we'd love to have these maps at an even more granular scale, because we know that, decisions about programs, are not always made at a county or state level. They're made at a municipal level or, at a utility scale level. So, we'd love to be able to kind of, and this is something that we've been talking about and sort of thinking about how we would do it, is, I think we would love to make this more granular so that we can have a really specific kind of geographic sense of where these deserts exist, what that looks like, in cities, say, or, other communities, because, I think that just helps us target efforts and be more aware of where the gaps are. Right now, the data does not exist at that level. So, we're working with what we've got, but we've been thinking about some ways to kind of move past that. So would love to know if that's a helpful direction for you, or if the kind of scale that we've offered it at here is enough.
All right, next question. Yeah. What was your methodology to collect the contractor workforce data?
Yeah, so we basically ran this two different ways to see what happened. We ended up using data from USEER, the U.S. Energy and Employment Report, which is
We've linked that in the chat already.
yes, thank you. Which is you know, a federally sponsored kind of study that happens every year of energy data. And this is data that is pulled from Bureau of Labor Statistics data on kind of occupation categories. And so there are some limitations to kind of how, you know, how granular it can be kind of divided in terms of like specific occupations. But basically, we did use the USEER data overall, but then we used some kind of special designations because we didn't want to capture just construction workers, knowing that, you know, somebody who's doing framing may not really be that engaged in an efficiency upgrade or knowledgeable or able to perform, you know, an efficiency upgrade, or somebody who's, you know, doing these other kind of tasks that are specialties in this sort of construction field. And so what we did is we used kind of the, you know, the specific high efficiency HVAC contractors really as a proxy for this, because those are going to be sort of the key ones. And then we also looked at people who are like installing insulation or, you know, a couple of other categories. But, you know, the kind of key to that was who is actually performing efficiency upgrades as part of their work on a regular basis. And so, you know, this excludes sort of contractors whose work is really not in that realm. And that's kind of a product of that data set that we ended up using. To cross-check that, though, we also used a data set from the Census Bureau, which kind of measures where workers live in different job categories and where they travel for work. And I think one of the striking things that we found about that, and that's something that we'd love to kind of release at a later date. We did it mainly just to kind of see, you know, is what we produced, does it feel right? And is it, you know, can we cross-check it with something else to make sure? And what we found, you know, when we did that was that a lot of workers kind of in the construction field live outside of major metro communities, probably because it's cheaper and wages tend to be lower kind of in construction generally. Not necessarily in advanced trades, but in construction generally. But then they move to kind of higher income areas for work on a day-to-day basis. So we kind of tracked some project flows that way using some data from the US Census Bureau. And it was kind of striking. I mean, I think, you know, we saw that like in cities like Atlanta, much of the workforce who's performing upgrades, they live, you know, outside of Atlanta, sometimes, you know, kind of far outside of Atlanta. And then they travel into the city where they're, you know, serving higher income households and, you know, upgrading those. And so you know, I think it was kind of interesting to see that there are a lot of communities that are very underserved by contractors when it comes to efficiency upgrades, but there is maybe a substantial amount of construction, you know, workers who live in that community. But because there's no money to do the work there or to do upgrades there, they're not actually serving the communities where they live. They're traveling, you know, to higher income places. So I think it, you know, in that way, that other data set really kind of underlines something that's, you know, kind of here, but maybe not as visible in this map. And that is that, you know, even if kind of high efficiency workers, or even if, you know, kind of the workforce lives in a community, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing work there just because of the way that, you know, this work is generally market driven. And so I think, you know, again, kind of reiterates that programs, particularly, you know, if you're focused on low income households or some of these underserved communities, which are almost as a rule low income, you know, capital has to be a key part of that. And pairing that with, you know, a contractor base is kind of a critical piece of program design. Yeah. Any other questions before we wrap up?
Haven't seen any others come in.
Okay. Well, maybe here in the last minute, I'll give a couple of shout outs. One to my colleagues Amy and Laura, who are both on this webinar, and also to Katie Strickland, who's our communications associate here at SEEA, who every month do a ton of work to get these maps up and out for y'all. I would say, please stay tuned. We do this every month. We usually have a different topic every month that we, dive into. And we're always looking for good suggestions about, what we should be thinking about. And so if there's ever any moment where it would be helpful for us to do some data analysis with you, or to support the work that you're doing, please do reach out to us. We're always, a lot of our work is really supporting communities throughout the South who don't have kind of dedicated research teams or arms. And, so a lot of our work is really intended to provide that kind of capacity where we can. So please, if there's ever a topic, if there's ever a research need, don't hesitate to reach out. I would say, continue to watch this space for future maps. Like I said, we publish these every month. We're going to be doing kind of one of these webinars every month just to have a little bit of a discussion about, what we found, how we did it, and why. I think the last thing is that we're really kind of always looking for feedback on the kinds of research that would be helpful to you. Our kind of guiding mantra as it is, that we don't want our research to sit on the shelf. We're not writing articles just to write articles, or we're not, publishing stuff in peer-reviewed journals just to kind of contribute to the discourse. We're doing data analysis and research because we think it can solve really important environmental, housing, social issues that we face in the South. And we want our work to guide that. And so if there's ever any way that we can help you, if you ever have, ideas about the types of research, the topics, the formats that would be most helpful, we always want to hear that. And to that end, we do have a short survey, just with a couple of questions about, what might be helpful to you in the future. We'd love for you to take it. We may have already dropped that in the chat.
We just did.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, we'd love to hear from you. We really appreciate you joining us today. And at any point, I'll reiterate, please feel free to reach out if we can ever be useful. And thanks for your time today. And we hope to connect with you soon.
Thanks, everybody.